Hello there everyone, in this video I'm going to go over the First Samnite War, which was fought way back in the days of the early Roman Republic. Now, I'm assuming most people, if not everyone, has heard of the Romans before, especially if you're watching this video, but that's not quite the case for the Samnites, so I'll just give you a quick rundown of their history before coming into contact with the Romans. The Greek philosopher Strabo wrote that originally the Samnites came from a group of exiled Sabines. Apparently, the Sabines were in the midst of a famine, so they did what's called a ver sacrum, which is a religious ritual where the adults would make a vow to the god of Mars that they would sacrifice the next generation of offspring, whether that be of human children or of cattle, and in return, hopefully, Mars would help them with whatever it is they needed. Now, I don't mean sacrifice like they tossed all the babies off cliffs or something. No. Well, I mean, they probably sacrificed the cattle's offspring like that, but the children were allowed to live. It's just that by either the age 20 or 21, they would be forced to leave their villages and towns and sent out to go find their own land. And usually this group of people were led by an animal of some sorts, like a bull or maybe some type of bird. Well, sometime, probably a long time before the period we're going to be talking about, the Sabines had one of these Verusacrums, and it was the children of the next generation who were told to follow an ox until it brought them to their new home. And when the ox stopped on a hill, the young men and women that made up this little group of exiles sacrificed this ox and named their new city Bovianum. Now, it wasn't right away that the Romans and Samnites began to quarrel. Actually, the only reason why they began to have problems with each other is because of another group called the Campanians. Now, the Campanians, they were another Italic tribe of people living in southern Italy, and these guys, they were part of the Osci nation, since they spoke a form of Oscan language. Living in the north of Campania, there was a tribe called the Sidicini, and these people and their land were coveted by the Samnites, especially their capital city of Teano, because it sat right on an important crossroad for trade. So, the Samnites, without provocation, attacked the Sidicini, and the Sidicini in turn went to the much larger and stronger peoples, the Campanians, and asked for their help. Well, the Campanians in the past, they had been quite the fierce foe to fight, but Livy says that they had grown too accustomed to luxury, so that when they faced off against the Samnites in Sidicini territory, they were easily beaten by them, because the Samnites, they were just much more of a warlike people at this time. The Samnites then followed up their victory by entering into Campanian territory and then claiming the Tifata Hills as their own. These foothills coming down from the Tifata mountain overlooked the city of Capua, and they were also the site of the first major battle during Sulla's civil war, which is hundreds of years in the future from now, but I thought I'd just mention it to show how intertwined early Roman history is. It seems like everything happens in the same few places between the same few families for like 500 years. The Samnites, after setting up camps up in the hills, then descended onto the plain that stretched from the hills to the city of Capua, and there, in a large open field battle, they defeated the Campanians for the second time, forcing them to retreat behind the walls of their city, and with no chance of beating the Samnites themselves, they decided that they would send ambassadors, the Campanians, would send ambassadors to the next biggest kid on the block and ask for help. And it just so happens that the next biggest kid was Rome. And when the ambassadors from Capua, finally made it to Rome, and in front of the Senate, they began by saying how the Campanians and the Romans, they had never had problems with each other, and that if the Volsci or the Aquii attacked you guys again, we'll come to help out, don't worry. And that one day, Rome could have all the territory that lay between the two peoples. They went on to ask for a treaty of friendship with the Romans, and that they knew the Romans already had a treaty with the Samnites, but that nothing in that treaty said the Romans weren't allowed to make a treaty with them too. They also made it a point to the senators that their city of Capua was just as prosperous and just as large as Rome, and that their land was some of, if not the most fertile soil in all of Italia, and that if the Romans didn't come and help save them, and add them to their list of friends, that the Samnites would eventually conquer them and they'd be counted amongst their enemies, and Rome would have lost great farming land and a great people as an ally. So the senators, they got together and they deliberated, many of them thinking how great it would be to have one of the largest and richest cities in Italy come over to their side and be under their control. They knew how much the farmland of Campania could provide for them and how great it would be to have some colonies on the sea for trading purposes. But in the end, the senators came to the conclusion that the treaties they had already made with the Samnites, they were too binding, and that they would offend the gods if they made new treaties with the Campanians that went against their old treaties with the Samnites. The Campanians, the ambassadors, were like, okay, fine. You don't want to help us? Well, guess what? You own us now. They surrendered themselves, the city of Capua, and the lands of Campania and all who dwelt in it, to the Romans. Now the senators, they were shocked, but also moved by the emotion shown by the envoys. In front of them was a people who not long ago were proud and confident in their independence, and now here they are willingly putting themselves under the rule of another just in hopes that they might survive. Well, the senators now were feeling like it would be dishonorable of them to refuse the Campanians, and that it was the right thing to do to help them. I mean, let's be honest here. This is probably just a story made up by the Romans so they could justify to themselves and to the gods that, hey, look, we didn't want to conquer the Samnites or take over Campania, we were asked to. And we were only defending our friends, okay? We didn't break no treaties. It was the Samnites who did when they attacked Campania. And I think it's kind of weird. The Romans of the Republic were just as, if not more aware of perception, than we are today. And they wanted to always be perceived as good or like in the right, even though they could have just done whatever they wanted. They were the biggest, baddest guys on the block. They could have done whatever, but they always seemed to have the need to be justified, even if only in their own minds, that what they were doing was right. When the Samnites heard the message from the Roman envoys, they were like, no, we will not stop attacking the Campanians. And actually, we think that you trying to tell us what to do because they surrendered themselves to you is ridiculous. So ridiculous that we're going to order our generals to go raid Campanian territory right now in earshot of you silly little Romans. Now, how do you like that? The Romans didn't like that very much at all, and when the news of the Samnite response reached Rome, the Senate decreed that a formal declaration of war should be submitted to the people for their approval, and when it was instantly ratified. The two consuls for that year who would be in charge of the war efforts against the Samnites were one Marcus Valerius Corvus, who, by the time of his death, will become one of the heroes of the Republic, with his most famous exploit being a victory over a large Gallic warrior in single combat before a battle. The story goes that while on campaign against the Gauls, one day, as the two sides were preparing for a battle, a gigantic Gaul in splendid armor came into the area between the two armies and began to challenge any Roman to single combat. Marcus, who was only a young military tribune at this time, stepped up and accepted the challenge. Now, as the two warriors closed in on each other, something strange happened. A crow entered the scene, and it flew over to, and then landed on the helmet of Marcus, facing towards the Gaul. And even when the two men began to fight, the bird, instead of flying away, began to peck and claw at the face of the Gaul, until in the end Marcus was able to slay him. And after the duel was done, the Romans, filled with thoughts of the gods being on their sides, rushed forward and drove off the remaining Gauls, who must have been thinking, what the heck was up with that bird? The other consul for that year was Aulus Cornelius Cassius Arvina, a descendant of the famous Aulus Cornelius Cassius, who was the man who killed the king of Veii, Lars Tolumnius, in single combat during the Battle of Fidenae. It said that he recognized the king during the battle and charged him on horseback, spearing the king off of his horse, and before he could get back up, Cassius was on top of him and repeatedly stabbing him with his spear until he was no more. Aulus then decapitated the king, put the head on his spear, and then paraded it around the battlefield, which in turn, the now leaderless army the Romans were facing lost heart and fled. This incident makes Caussus one of only 3 men in the history of Rome to receive the spolia opima, which was the armor, weapons, and any other pieces taken from the body of a slain enemy commander. The other 2 being when the founder of Rome, Romulus, defeated Acron, the king of the Campanians, and the third one was during the Second Punic War when Marcus Claudius Marcellus defeated Viridomarus, a king of the Gesate people, in single combat. The Cornelia family is actually full of famous Romans. In the generations to come, this family will produce 2 more of the most famous Romans of the Republic, Scipio Africanus and the infamous dictator Lucius Cornelius Sulla. But back to the story now. Valerius took his army into Campania and made his way to Mount Glauris, today's Mount Barbaro, where he made camp and engaged in skirmishing activities for a couple days until he was ready for battle. I want you soldiers to follow my deeds and not my words, and to look to me not only for the word of command, but also for example. A part of Marcus Valerius' speech to his men before the battle. One day, after Valerius gave his men that rousing speech, the army filed out of the camp they had built to meet the Samnites in open battle. And in doing so, Valerius found the enemy to be just as tough and keen on battle as the Romans were, and for a long time the 2 sides clashed back and forth with nothing to separate them. So Valerius, taking initiative, decided to gather his cavalry together and charge the Samnite line to see if that would get them to break. But the attack failed and the cavalry was forced to pull back after an ineffective charge. Valerius rode back to the front of his legionaries and dismounted his horse. He then ordered his cavalry to the flanks and then told his men, "Soldiers, this task belongs to us infantry. Come on. Wherever you see me making my way through the enemy's lines with my sword, follow, and each of you do his best to cut down those in front. All that ground which is now glittering with uplifted spears you shall see cleared by a vast carnage." Then Valerius led the charge towards the Samnite line at the head of his men, and killed the first man he reached. The soldiers he was leading saw this and got fired up, and it said that all men on his left and on his right charged straight forward into the enemy line and began a fight to remember. Even with all the death surrounding the Samnite standards, they still stood and fought just as ferociously as the Romans, charging them. But over time, they began to lose too many men too quickly, and seemed to be giving ground. Luckily for them, though, night was upon them, and it allowed them to retreat to their camp, where during the night they fled, leaving the Romans masters of the field. It said that it was the fire in the eyes of the Romans and the looks of complete madmen that they carried that was the eventual cause of the Samnite withdrawal, and when the Romans found their camp empty the next day, they captured it and celebrated with the people of Capua. And now, right around the same time, Cornelius Caussus, the other consul, had led his army out from the town of Saticula, modern-day Sant Agata de Goti. This was a town owned by the Caudini tribe, who were part of the Samnites. Cornelius had wanted to lead his army through a narrow mountain pass, but without sending out the scouts, he failed to realize that the Samnites had already taken up positions on the heights of the valley, and were just waiting for the Romans to enter the pass so that they could trap them in there, and then start raining down missiles upon their heads until they either surrendered or were all dead. Well, the Romans, by the time they realized they were trapped, it was too late. Too late to retreat, and they found themselves in quite the dire situation with no ideas of how to get out of it. Until a military tribune by the name of Publius Decius Mus, who in time will become another hero of the Republic, but for now, he had to get his fellow Romans out from this trap. Decius went to Cornelius and said, "Sir, I've spotted a peak that kind of juts out over the camp of the Samnites, and for some reason they haven't stationed any men on it, and if you were to give me a detachment of Hastati, and some Principes, We could summit that peak and make it so that the Samnites wouldn't be able to attack you without facing an attack from above at the same time. So while we rain down missiles on them, you can make your escape with the rest of the army. Cornelius was like, hell yeah, dude, that'd be freaking sick. Please, go do that. So Decius gathered together about, 1,600 men, it says, and set off for the summit of this little peak. And surprisingly, the Samnites didn't notice him and his men until it was too late for them. The Romans rushed up the steep hillside and took the peak that was just overlooking the Samnite camp, and the Samnites, they were pissed because he had just snatched a certain victory away from them. Now, for some reason, with the consul's army escaped to safety, and Decius only having about 1,600 men with him, the Samnites kind of just stood around like, what do we do now? They didn't completely encircle Decius or try and come up the hill to attack him. They kind of just stood around waiting for somebody to take charge and make a move. Decius, though, seeing this, came to the conclusion that he wasn't going to wait around and that he would be the one to make a move. And during the evening time, he scouted out the Samnite positions around him and came up with a plan. When he had devised his plan and set up the watches for the night, he ordered that a tessera was to be brought to all the men with him. A tessera was just a small wooden or clay tablet used by the Romans, pass secret notes and stuff. This tessera said that when you hear the bugle tonight that's supposed to mark the start of the second watch, instead, you all come to me and assemble, and do it quietly. This silence, soldiers, must be maintained, and all applause as you listen to me checked. When I have laid my proposals fully before you, those of you who approve will cross over silently to the right. The opinion of the majority will be adopted. Now listen to my plans. With his men gathered around him, Decius laid out the plan. They would stealthily make their way out of their camp, down the slope, and then as quietly as humanly possible, they would try and sneak their way through the Samnites, who were sleeping all around them. And if they were to cause them to wake, the plan was for everybody to let out a shout and fall upon anything that moved while they tried to make their way through the camp of the enemy. Well, this went exactly how you think it would. They made it about halfway through the Samnites when a soldier who wasn't paying attention smacked his shield into a guy who was sleeping, waking him up. That guy then turned to his buddy and shook him awake and was like, hey, what was that? Because remember, it's nighttime and they couldn't really see very well. These two guys making a ruckus was causing more of the other men around them to wake up too, so Decius, knowing their cover was blown, ordered his men to shout and start hacking away. The Samnites, they were in complete shock and confusion, which actually made it pretty easy for the Romans to cut their way through anybody who tried to oppose them, and eventually they found themselves outside the limits of the Samnite camp and making their way in the direction that the consul went in earlier. All honor to you, brave Romans. Your march up that height and your return will be extolled in every age. But for the due recognition of such courage, the light of day is needed. You have deserved something more than to carry your glory back to camp hidden in silence of night. We will rest here and wait for daylight. Valerius to his men after the escape. When morning came, and when the men who had been saved by Decius and his men learned that the soldiers who had sacrificed themselves yesterday for them were actually safe and sound and making their way back to camp, they all rushed out to meet the returning soldiers. And when Decius and his troops got back to camp, it was kind of like a little mini triumph with them marching around through the camp while everyone cheered and gave them praises. And then when Decius reached Valerius, the consul, who was about to give him more praise, Decius stopped him and said, wait a second. This stuff can wait, man. Let's go get those Samnites while they're all disorganized and reeling from last night. Like, this is the perfect opportunity that we shouldn't be wasting spending time giving ourselves praises and honors. Like, let's go get those guys, man. Valerius was like, word. Like, yes, let's go. Okay, I'll follow you then. He ordered the men to be drawn up in battle formation. They then made their way back towards the Samnites, and when they came upon them, it turned out that the events of the night before had scattered them all into different groups, and many of them hadn't even come back to collect their weapons and armor yet. And they kind of panicked, and most of them tried to rush back into their camp, while others fled into the wilderness, but it was no use. The Romans fell on them, and then the camp next, and in the end it said that some 30,000 Samnites lost their lives that day. After the fighting was done, Valerius assembled all the men together again and gave all the rewards and praise he could to Decius for his efforts. It said that Decius received a golden chaplet and 100 oxen, of which one of them was a beautiful white with gilded horns. The men who were with Decius on the heights above the Samnites were rewarded with double rations and 2 tunics each. So, yeah, not as nice of a reward for the rank and file, but Decius actually, after sacrificing the white ox, gave the other 99 to the men that had been with him, so they at least got some meat out of the ordeal. But I guess, that's just how it goes, the majority doing all the work and the minority taking all the credit and rewards for it. Now, the Samnites, after getting beat for a second time, you would think they were done trying for a little while, but nope. Only a short time after their defeat at Sidicula, the Samnites thought they'd give it another go, calling up more men to fight and to fill the spots of the men they had lost already, and they hoped that they could beat the Romans at Sucella. Well, Valerius heard of the still threatening Samnites, and he immediately got his troops marching towards Sucella, leaving behind the baggage train, pack animals, and camp followers, so that they could move faster. And when he arrived in the vicinity of the Samnite force, he set up his camp, which actually looked much smaller than a normal camp would, just because it was just due to the men only having to build a camp big enough to fit themselves, and not all the extra stuff and people that usually accompany an army. The Samnites, they saw this small camp that the Romans had built, and they assumed that there must be a much smaller force than usual inside, so they lined up for battle and began to approach the Roman camp. The Samnite warriors, they just wanted to fill in the ditch and start attacking the walls, believing that their numbers would win them the day. But the Samnite leaders held their men back. They were thinking that the Romans, they would be in time forced to leave their camp when they ran out of food, and that is when the Samnites would attack. But when Valerius noticed that the Samnites were sending out quite a few foraging parties and left only a small guard outside the Roman camp, as well as just a small garrison back at their own camp, he decided the time to fight was now. It said he spoke a few words of encouragement to his men, and then they rushed out of their gates of their own camp towards the camp of the Samnites. He went forward with his men in an open column and sent the cavalry to round up the scattered Samnites like so much game and drove them against his army. There was an immense slaughter, for they were too terrified to think under what standard to rally or whether to make for their camp or flee further afield. Their fears drove them into such a hasty flight that as many as 40,000 shields, far more than the number of slain, and military standards, including those captured in the storming of the camp, to the number of 170, were brought to the consul. He then returned to the Samnite camp, and all the booty there was given to the soldiers. With a third catastrophic defeat being dealt to them, the Samnites had had enough. The news of these victories for the Romans spread far and wide. The Falarii people came to Rome and actually asked if the 40-year peace treaty they had with them could be made into a treaty that was for all time. The various Latin groups who had been looking to test Rome also thought better of it, at least for now. The Carthaginians, who at this time also had a treaty with Rome, they sent their congratulations to the Roman Senate, as well as a golden crown that was to be placed in the temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline. It said that the crown weighed 25 pounds. With the war with the Samnites being over for the time being, and the soldiers back in their summer camps, the two consuls, Marcus Valerius Corvus, Birdboy, and Aulus Cornelius Cassius, both were given and celebrated a triumph. The Samnites, well, they aren't done completely. No, this is the first war. The first war, it was just a taste of what's to come in the second, or otherwise known as Great Samnite War, which will last for not just 2 years, but 22 years, and will deal the Romans one of their most famous defeats, well, infamous defeats, in the Caudine Forks. That is for another time. I hope you enjoyed listening, or watching, whichever one you do, and thank you very much for checking it out. See you later, and have a good one.
What a dreadful noise plebs make when they're happy.